In just 72 hours,
Cannabis will be legal in Canada.
Our country is about to change.
It's a big deal. Bit more oomph.
this is a big deal.
I feel excited about legalization of cannabis.
I've been waiting for this day for so long.
I feel like it's a really important step forward for our society.
I call it cannabis.
Weed.
Mishkiki.
Weed.
Cannabis.
Cannabis.
Blaze it. Okay, sorry.
The first time I used cannabis was to help treat my migraines.
The first time I used cannabis, I was enlightened.
It's almost like a miracle drug for me.
I've never used cannabis.
I'm worried that
I'm worried
that the distribution will cause people to head more towards dealers.
That after legalization, marijuana will become too expensive.
that local producers and local dispensary owners will not be included.
That some people are going to overdo it when cannabis is first legalized, but overall I think it's going to be positive.
There is a lot of unanswered questions.
I have questions.
I have questions.
I need answers.
I need answers.
I need answers.
In just 3 days, cannabis will be legal right across Canada, not just for medicinal use, but for whatever use you may have for it. You can smoke it, drink it, eat it, consume it just about any way you like. But how is it all going to work? Well, we've invited Canadians, all with a serious stake in this issue, to ask their questions. Some of them joining us here in studio, some will hear by video, and to answer those questions, we have joining us our esteemed panel, Bill Blair, Federal Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. He's been the government's lead on the cannabis file. Thanks so much for being here.
Andrew.
Dr. Gigi Osler, head of the Canadian Medical Association. Gigi, Dr. Osler, which do you prefer?
Gigi is fine.
Gigi's fine, okay. And we have lawyer Kirk Tusaw, who's also a consultant for Cannabis Growth. Kirk, I can call you Kirk, that's
Absolutely.
okay? All
Thanks,
right,
Andrew.
we'll keep things conversational. And that is, of course, one of the world's largest cannabis companies. So thank you to the three of you for being here. Now, I do want to be clear. This isn't a debate about whether legalization is the right thing to do. It is happening, period. And most Canadians support that. Indeed, the folks asking questions tonight do too. But there are questions. So let's try to understand all of this a little bit better. Let's get started. Take a look.
My name is Elaine Farrell. I have been working for the Toronto Transit Commission close to 27 years. And I am fighting for the rights to use cannabis CBD oil for the chronic pain that I have. I have bilateral sciatica in both legs. I have herniated disc in my lower back, 2 of them, and 1 in my neck. So I went on CBD oil for 2.5 months, and the difference was tremendous.
Elaine, thanks for being here. What's your question?
How will the workers' rights be balanced and my rights to be able to use cannabis either for medicinal or recreational?
Right. And so, Minister Blair, this is, I think, perhaps an appropriate question for you, because I suppose on the medicinal side, employers do have an obligation to accommodate their employees, as in any medical situation.
In fact, in Canada, we've had experience with medical cannabis for almost 2 decades in this country. And employers are working, I think, very diligently right now to ensure that we strike the appropriate balance between the right of their employers to have appropriate medical treatments and a safe workplace.
So on the recreational side of things, though, that's where it gets a little bit murkier. I mean, what is the framework there?
So for people who are in a safety-sensitive position, there are likely to be developed rules regarding cannabis use and fitness for the work that they are required to perform. There's been a lot of research on this and a lot of work done, but I think more needs to be done. And we're hearing, just last week, a number of police services and the Canadian Forces have come out with new regulations with respect to that issue as well.
Except, I mean, what's noteworthy about that is in a way, it seems like different workplaces are scrambling in different ways, and the differences are stark just when we talk about police forces. So Calgary Police will not be allowed to use cannabis at all, not even when off duty. Toronto Police won't be permitted to use cannabis within 28 days of reporting for duty. West Vancouver Police restricting cannabis to within 24 hours of a shift. In Saskatchewan, there's no time limit at all, so long as you are fit for duty when you report to work. This seems like a bit of a patchwork series of solutions and quite confusing.
I think a number of chiefs are being quite cautious. The standard that has been in place for over a century for police officers is they have to be fit for duty. Frankly, it's a fairly straightforward determination for those who might be under the influence of alcohol, for example. But the the familiarity with cannabis impairment among law enforcement officials is perhaps not as developed, but I think those positions will evolve over time based on the evidence.
Kirk, does an employer have the right to reach into a person's personal life and say, you know, it's one thing to say you can't consume cannabis while you're here at work, but you also can't do it at home?
I don't think they should have that right. I mean, at the end of the day, this is going to be a legal substance to consume for recreational or any purpose that you wish. And the concern I have is that a lot of employers may rely on drug testing to determine impairment. And drug testing for cannabis in particular is a difficult subject because cannabis metabolizes into your fat and is stored by your body for a tremendously long period of time, weeks or over a month. And so when you're testing people for the presence of these metabolites, you're not really getting a clear picture of whether they were, to use Minister Blair's words, fit for the job, fit for duty.
What is considered impairment at work, and who decides that for the workers?
Well, it's interesting. Minister Blair said something about alcohol and said essentially it's pretty easy to tell if somebody's not fit for duty when it comes to alcohol. And that's because alcohol produces significant impairing effects. Cannabis, particularly for people that use it on a chronic basis for medical conditions, I have for the last 17 years for chronic pain, very difficult to tell if somebody's, quote unquote, impaired by cannabis, even though they might be under the influence of it.
Does the research shed any light on this? Because, Kirk, as you point out, I mean, THC can stay in the body for an awful long time.
I think the research is very varied. And I agree with Minister Blair that more research will help to shed a light on impairment and usage and help reduce some of the discomfort that employers may be feeling.
Okay, our next question. This is from Signe in British Columbia. Watch this.
My name is Signe Knudsen. I'm an artist and a mom. I'm also a medicinal and recreational cannabis user. What I want to know is once cannabis is legalized, what are the parental liabilities if a teenager accesses it at home? Also, wouldn't it be safer if kids are going to use it anyway for a teen to access it at home from a parent instead of illegally somewhere else?
Okay, Kirk, I think this is one for you. And we'll start with the first part of her question, which was, I suppose, the legal consequences of a child, a teenager getting into their parents' stash.
Well, I'm a parent of 4. I've got kids ranging from 8 to 18 years of age, so it's a question that I've thought about. I also have cannabis in my home because I'm a cannabis consumer and have been for 32 years. I think there's a way we deal with this in society right now with respect to alcohol. And we don't impose some sort of arbitrary restrictions on parental conduct. We don't criminalize parents who have alcohol. We don't require parents to put locks on their alcohol cabinets, even though consumption of alcohol, we know, leads to death or serious danger.
So fair point. It's hard to imagine a scenario where you could accidentally do 8 shots of tequila. But I think...
Is it?
I think you might notice on the first shot.
There are young people consuming too much alcohol on a daily basis.
So that's fair. However, what I would say is it's much easier for me to imagine a scenario where a teenager might accidentally ingest a pot brownie or a gummy bear that's infused with cannabis and not even realize it in that moment and only realize it minutes, hours down the line.
I think this, and I'm putting my parent hat on right now, I think this is an opportunity for parents to start having conversations with their children about cannabis use and how to use it safely and wisely. In terms of accidental ingestion for children, one recommendation may be to treat it like a prescription medication or treat it like alcohol. Keep it out of the reach of young children in particular. Because young children, let's say it isn't edible and they think it's a gummy or they think it's a brownie, and whatever amount they ingest may be just simply too much for their smaller bodies.
And I just wanted to clear up something that the lady who spoke earlier, when she talked about, isn't it better to give the drug to your kids if they're going to use it anyway? I want to be really clear. No, it's not. And the law is clear that it is an offense. It'll be an offense under these regulations and the law to give cannabis or to sell cannabis to a person under the age of 18.
But criminalizing parents for providing cannabis to their teenagers in the home is an absolute horror show and a mistake. We don't do it for alcohol, and we know people can die from consuming alcohol. So we should not be doing it for cannabis. That was a miss by the federal government. It prevents exactly what we should be encouraging, which is conversations between parents and kids on a real level, not some artificial level dictated by government.
You know, one of the things that has followed people who consume cannabis is the stigma around it, certainly. Have a look at this. In a poll commissioned exclusively for CBC News, 36% of those asked believe that there will be less stigma around pot usage, which leads us to our next question.
Hi, my name is Malik Scott. Last year, I was arrested for marijuana possession. I believe that racial profiling had a huge part in that. The first time I was arrested, I was in a parking lot, and all of a sudden I see a cop car, and for some reason I got this strange feeling, and I decided to leave the parking lot. So as I'm leaving, they park right in front of me and kind of box me in. It was put on me time and time again that I had marijuana on me when I didn't, and I was taken into the police station for that. After that, the case was dropped. The second time, same song and dance as last time, I ended up getting pulled into the station. Again, they found nothing on me, and I was sent on my way.
Hi, Malik. What's your question?
So with this future legalization coming up, I'm wondering how exactly will it affect racial profiling and policing? Also, the people who've been convicted and even incarcerated for cannabis use or dealing, what have you, will they receive any amnesty when it is legalized?
Racial profiling is abhorrent, unacceptable, and unlawful. It's unlawful in Canada. It's contrary to the Canadian Human Rights Act. It's contrary to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so any individual and any police officer engaging in racial profiling is breaking the law.
And would you concede that it has been a problem?
Oh, I've conceded many, many years ago. If you don't acknowledge its existence, you can't do anything about it. We've worked awfully hard to actually address some of those concerns.
And so how does legalization change the equation?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the enforcement of cannabis laws in Canada has had a disproportionate effect on minority communities, racialized communities, young black men, Indigenous, mostly young males, but also all Indigenous people, poor communities. There has been a disproportionate and therefore unjust impact on many communities. And our government's made it very clear, starting on the 17th of October, when the law is repealed and replaced, it gives us an opportunity to take a look at those convictions that some people have for simple possession of cannabis and deal with those in the appropriate way at the appropriate time.
But why couldn't that have been done concurrently with all of the planning to establish this regulatory framework?
Simply because you cannot nullify the law. Until the repeal and replace takes place, the law remains in effect. It's the only system of cannabis control that currently exists.
And but could this not all have unfolded very quickly? I mean, let me ask it a different way. What is it that
many people are suggesting we're going too fast, but quite frankly, we've been very cautious and careful as we've approached these new regulations. On October 17th, that takes effect. And from that moment on, we stop criminalizing those kids for criminal possession of cannabis, and it also gives us an opportunity after to deal more appropriately with those existing records, and that's our intent.
Do you believe that there'll be any amnesty given to the people already incarcerated and have had their time taken from them?
Malik, the law that existed was upheld and enforced. It's been tested in our courts and found to be constitutional. But we believe that the impact of those criminal records is disproportionate to the offense. And we know that it's been disproportionately impactful on certain communities, and we want to fix that.
Let's look forward. In legal jurisdictions where cannabis has been legalized, where possession of cannabis has been legalized, you've seen tremendous drops in enforcement. You've seen something like 90 to 95% drops in enforcement of the cannabis laws. And so I think we're going to see it get better. I find it somewhat unfortunate that the Cannabis Act continues to take a criminal law-based approach with exemptions. I'm looking forward to legalization 2.0 when we can move beyond a criminal law-based approach and have a truly regulatory-only approach. And I think we'll get there. I hope we get there soon.
Let's get to our next question.
My name's Josie. I have struggled with mental health issues for most of my teen years. I started smoking weed at 14, and by 15, I was a full-blown pothead. I consider myself to be a marijuana addict, and I'm getting treatment for it right now. I will take a dark roast, please. The symptoms that I struggled with were intense paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and sometimes visual hallucinations. I received treatment for it, and I no longer struggle with psychosis, but I do struggle with cannabis addiction. I would tell other young people in Canadian to respect marijuana as a mind-altering substance, not to demonize cannabis use, but to do it responsibly if they are going to do it underage. Please keep in mind that your brain has not finished developing and that you could have negative effects.
What is the question that you'd like to ask?
My question is, what do we have in place to address marijuana addiction after legalization, especially for youth? And there's not a lot of research to show what the long-term impact of regular cannabis use is, especially among young brains. And I was wondering what the government has planned to address this issue.
First of all, I want to thank Josie for her question. I think your testimony is compelling. And I would like every young person to hear the caution that you offer from your lived experience, because I think young people have to know that this drug is not necessarily benign and that there are significant risks.
You know, alcohol, pretty easy for teens to get a hold of, despite the regulation in place. I think, quite frankly, it's easy to get cannabis as well. Is that just going to get worse?
It's very important to understand, Andrew, that we're not merely legalizing cannabis. We're implementing a very strict and comprehensive system of regulation that'll control every aspect of its production, distribution, and consumption.
But a system that already exists in terms of alcohol, and yet we have a problem.
Well, we do have a problem, but one of the challenges with cannabis, you know, Josie mentioned the lack of research. In a criminal prohibitive environment, research has been very, very challenging, if not impossible, in a lot of jurisdictions, simply because how do you do longitudinal tests or clinical trials in an environment where you're talking about an illegal substance? And so it's only in a regulated environment that research can now begin to take place. We also recognize, and our government has said, the revenue that is generated from the excise sales, the excise tax of cannabis, needs to be reinvested in research, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation.
But help me to understand exactly what you're saying here, because are you saying that the bulk of the meaningful research can't really happen until regulation happens, and so therefore between
First of all, there has been a great deal of research, but in a regulated environment, I think that creates a new environment for research that will be far more effective and allow us to learn more about the use and misuse of this substance.
If I could ask you then, at this point, do you expect marijuana use, overuse, and addiction to get markedly worse?
My very sincere hope is that through making it more difficult for young people to access this drug, by displacing the illicit market, which will take time, but that's very much part of what we're trying to achieve.
But we all hope that. I think we're all on the same
page. But Andrew, right now, under the criminal sanction, we have the highest rates of cannabis use among our kids of any developed country in the world. And we just have to do better.
Is what you're hearing here, does that resonate for you? I mean, is this the start of an answer for you?
When I was smoking weed in high school, there was no legal weed smoking age. So there was no, this is how to do it responsibly. So I don't think marijuana should be demonized, but I do think that people should have as much information about marijuana, especially if you're under 25, on how marijuana can impact you. And I hope that there is an education plan in place, maybe in schools, to say, oh, marijuana is impacting your school life, or you're overly paranoid to the point of psychosis. Who am I going to talk to? And is it okay to say, hey, marijuana is not right for me?
Dr. Osler, clear the air a bit for us. What do we know about the long-term health impacts of cannabis use, particularly on young people?
Well, Josie's talked about the age of 25, and we know brain development continues up until the age of 25. And we also know that the younger cannabis use starts, the more frequent the use, the type of product is being used, can have an effect on that developing brain. And personally, I'm heartened to hear from Minister Blair that more resources will be put into counseling and addiction services. I think it's vitally important to have that in place as a promise to Canadians.
Josie, thank you.
Thank you so much
for your question. We did have many more questions from Canadians concerned about cannabis legalization, including these.
What is the government going to do to foster innovation in the cannabis industry?
Is it fair to say that when you talk about innovation, edibles is one key area?
Edibles is one area, absolutely.
How can we convince these young and novice drivers that driving while impaired by cannabis, it can be dangerous?
Will the government respect Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights to self-regulate the cannabis industry within our own territories?
Minister Blair?
Yeah, it's an important discussion.
Much more to see. You can catch a special extended version of the National Conversation Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on CBC News Network. We hope you'll tune in.